Hey, innovator, are you tired of the same old competitive mechanics that pit you against other people? Want to learn how the experts create compelling experiences that bring people together around a shared purpose? Well, you're in for a treat. You're about to get the chance to hang out with a group of accomplished cooperative game designers and learn how they approach this fast-growing part of the gaming world. Daniel Cook is the co-founder of Spry Fox, author of the popular and influential Lost Garden blog, and creator of many amazing games including Alpha Bear, Triple Town, and the cooperative MMO Steambirds Alliance. Chelsea Howe is the director of VR studio Alchemy Labs. She previously designed games for Electronic Arts, TinyCo, and Super Better Labs, and in her spare time, she co-creates experimental cooperative games with her partner, Michael Molinari. Matt Leacock is a UX designer turned board game superstar. He created the hit cooperative games Pandemic and Forbidden Island, and developed numerous spin-offs and extensions, including the innovative hit Pandemic Legacy. If you want to learn how to engage your customers with teamwork and cooperation, this episode is for you. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell so you'll never miss a thing. Once you've done that, sit back, relax, and soak in all the cooperative gaming goodness.
How did you get to game design and then co-op, and then you've created these hits?
Yeah, so I've been designing games since I was a kid. I think partly that was just because I was disappointed with so many games that were out there, and I want to make them better. So I just kind of took it on myself to try to make better games. And I did that for many, many years and played all sorts of games all along. And ended up playing a lot of different types of games with my wife, Donna. And I remember some very vivid experiences playing heavier games with her and negotiation games, and them just leaving really sour tastes in our mouths. Where I would try to win, and if I did win, I felt terrible about it because it bled into our relationship or the way we interacted, and I had a lot of really bad experiences with that kind of thing. But when I played cooperative games, I realized that none of that stuff actually happened. We had a great time together, especially when we lost, or if we lost terribly, we always had a good time. So I thought they were really fascinating things to design as well. So I tried to tackle them myself, and that's where I got started.
That's so interesting. Chelsea, what about you?
So I got into game design because I loved making worlds with other people, and creating a game is just creating a world and a rule set and a happy space with lots of other folks. And I didn't really realize that was why I liked it so much for a while. But after I did, it just seemed to follow naturally that those were also the mechanics that I enjoyed in games. Something that invites the players to play together, to create together, to make beautiful experiences together. Just always appealed to me far more than things about, limitations and competition and stack ranking and judgment and all of those sort of less socially pleasant emotions for me, at least. And I loved seeing how people played and making spaces where they could play together.
Beautiful. How about you, Dan?
So I got into game design because there was a programmer and a musician, and they needed someone to kind of figure out what we were making. And there wasn't really a name for it back then. So I was drawing what the interfaces looked like. Then they said, well, that's sort of like coming up with features, so why don't you do that? So that's what I started doing. Then for the cooperative stuff, I would play a bunch of multiplayer games, but they were all competitive. And I would become a very angry, horrible person. Like, I would swear at people. I would just become this horrible ball of rage when I played these multiplayer games. And I really didn't like who I was when I played those games. And then I started looking into some more cooperative stuff, and I'm like, oh, this is really nice and interesting. But at the time, there wasn't very much design on cooperative games. There wasn't very much design on, for example, nonviolent games. So I sort of said, well, this is an interesting area. Let's dig into it further. And so I sort of took it on as a personal challenge, like maybe we can make cooperative games. This was before cooperative games had really taken off in the board game space. Obviously, there were folk games that were cooperative. And I just started digging into it as sort of a personal exploration. Then I had this other personal challenge, which was, how do we make the world a better place? How do we actually improve things? And I was looking at competitive games, and competitive games did not seem to be actively making the world a better place. But cooperative games, as I researched it, I was like, oh, wait, people are forming friendships in these games. They're forming these social bonds, and those things actually make people's lives better. So I was like, maybe we can make cooperative games that improve the sort of connective tissue between people, and therefore improve their day-to-day lives.
And you've been making some cooperative games.
Oh yeah, for years now, many cooperative games.
What's the one you're working on right now?
We're working on like 3 of them right now. The one that's announced right now is we've got an MMO called Steambirds, which is it's a very traditional genre of shooter, bullet hell shooter. So you run around and you shoot things, but the whole thing is cooperative. So everyone works together. We've got a lot of non-zero sum mechanics in there where everyone can basically help each other. There's this idea of things are better together. If I've got a friend nearby, the whole experience is going to be better. We're going to be able to help each other out, and we'll be able to tackle bigger things, cooperate more, and build trust by playing with one another.
That's fantastic. So, Matt, what are you working on right now?
Well, I've been continuing to work on the pandemic series, usually putting out 1 or 2 pandemic-related products every year. We just released a Forbidden game as well, so I've got 2 different cooperative board game lines that I continue to kind of like care and nurture. And then I've always got other games in the pipeline on the whiteboard that I'm working on, others that are not announced quite yet.
Exciting. We'll come back to that, and we're going to dig deep into cooperative mechanics. But Chelsea, I also want to open up. Is there anything you're working on right now that has the flavor or style of a cooperative game?
So right now, like my main focus is still single player VR, but that means that on the side, I get to do all of the kind of multiplayer, social, cooperative experiments that I've always loved to do. So the game that Michael's been working on and that I've been helping with at Studio Bean is a music rhythm game called Overpass, but we're working on developing a creator community essentially. And so this is less of a like what brand new mechanics can we come up with, and more of a what does the meta look like that facilitates cooperative play. We've found that we put out, Choice Chamber, which was a game that involved the entire Twitch chat as you play, and the retention on that wasn't as good as the game that we'd released previously, Sound Dodger, which actually had a way for people to create content kind of for that space. And so that's been an interesting sort of balance for me, is that it's not always the social mechanics that give you the stickiness and the retention and create those communities. Sometimes it's just very minimal features that allow people to come together and create. So that's kind of what we've been playing with and investigating recently.
That's interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, and community and cooperative game systems and game mechanics seem like there's some real connection and overlap there.
Yeah,
and
sure.
yeah, and that was how I came into cooperative, was initially through community design, and then my first co-op game design experience was Rock Band. And I got that gig because I had played in bands for 10 years. And I knew what that was. And, that small group, Dan and I just were working on this together, Dan mostly, at Horseshoe with group size and stickiness and group dynamics. But, Rock Band was really based around this 4-person, 5-person group size. That's a really interesting group size for engaging together and think of board games and such. And I'd like to touch on that, the multiple group size thing as well. But I wanted to actually start off by for everybody that might not know as much as us about positive sum and zero sum design, you know, we're hinting at the difference. You know, positive sum design, people play together, but what is that? How do you define zero sum, positive sum design? When you explain to people in your world, oh, I design cooperative games. How do you explain that? Anybody, take a crack at it.
I think the simplest thing for me is that you're all working together against the game. People seem to understand that terminology. Like you don't have a physical human component, opponent in front of you. The game components have to provide for that in a board game. You're working against these little algorithms that are generated out of cardboard. So that's how generally I describe it.
Yeah, sort of player versus environment, where the environment is either the system or the algorithm that's behind things. I haven't heard positive sum before. I've always used non-zero sum. Positive sum is a little more elegant way of saying it. And this comes from economics. And the basic idea is zero sum resources are, oh, look, here's an apple on the table. If I take the apple, you don't get the apple. So there's only one apple, and if I have it, you don't have it. And you're probably sad and angry because I took your apple and you wanted the apple, right? Particularly in video games, because we have digital resources, I can do something where instead there's an apple dispenser there. And if I take the apple, I've got my apple, I earned one apple, and I'm happy with my apple. And then Chelsea could take an apple too. And she has her apple, I have my apple. And so there wasn't a zero sum. It was, there was as many apples as there are people. But now we may only get one. There's still limits on it. I can't take 1,000,000 apples. But that sort of situation, it takes the inherent competition out of that mechanism. And so a lot of times you can build things. So likes in a social media system are a form of non-zero sum or positive sum interaction. We can all like a thing. Me liking a thing doesn't take away your ability to like a thing. So you see that type of economic interaction, that class of economic interaction throughout all sorts of cooperative and social systems.
I'm going to be the esoteric one again and say that for me, it's about an experience that's made more beautiful with shared intention. So when you both go in with some sort of shared intent, knowing that together you can have more fun or more beauty or more experience than you could separately. So I've found amazing communities around competitive games that are really, really intriguing to me. And I think that to me that counts as cooperative play at a meta level. And again, I love going from very high up to very low down. But I think it's that fundamental understanding of wanting to, as like Bernie DeKoven would say, play the well-played game and play it together for the best outcome for both of you or all of you.
Yeah, the sum of the parts is greater than the how's that go? Anyway, I don't know what I was trying to say.
Yeah. So, I think that there are a couple of different, if we get into the subtleties, there's really a couple different drivers going on. What Matt talked about, which is banding together to compete against the system, is one kind of positive sum play. And I love that example. To me, that's like a principle, but there's also the urge of shared creativity, like in Minecraft. And you can add a countdown timer to it to make it be competing against the system, right? You can add scarcity in time or resources, or scarcity in some other form. And likes have no scarcity, so they have less value, but then they can just be lots of them, right? So of course, as game designers, we all know that balance with scarcity and co-op. So I think there's the shared creativity urge that some people really enjoy. There's the shared strategy, which is like, how can we all work together and exchange information? And, as Dan says, asymmetric information to drive, creativity. And they're both really powerful, sustainable forms of co-op play.
Well, one thing that we're running into here is in pop culture, we often describe life in terms of competition, in terms of struggle, in terms of like very, A versus B. But it turns out that the vast majority of life is not like that. That is a very specific Western pop culture understanding of the world. If you look at the majority of how we live our lives, we are cooperative social animals. So if you take out all the things that are direct competition in your life, cooperation is pretty much everything else. It is going out to drinks together. It is the way that we drive on the roads together. It is how we work together in teams. So cooperation is fundamental to being human, and it is a broad spectrum of interactions. So really, by saying that we're doing cooperative design, we're saying, let's take this very, very narrow and limited view of humanity, which is competition and struggle, put that off to the side, and let's make games about the rest of our lives. So when we talk about cooperation, it's really a very large subject.
I love that. Yeah. And so the interesting thing is then how to abstract it so it becomes a good game, right? One of the examples that I love to express the basic, PVE, player versus environment, or team versus environment, that Matt's going to speak more to, because you've designed these games that bring that to life. One of the things about it that is so easy to understand is, one, it has competition in it. You say, well, I'm a competitive person. And you're like, well, but you and the team can compete against the environment. And a great pop culture example of that is the movie The Martian and the book The Martian, right? Because everybody in the movie bands together across, various boundaries to get the Martian home, to get him home. And the environment is so intense, it's the whole universe that they're competing against. So it's very grand scale. And it's very inspiring to me. Like, I like playing that game. But then there's all these other forms, like, as you say, Dan, what was The Sims, right? Which got turned into a multiplayer game in all these ways, and just trade games and other games, and games about, just banding together to accomplish something larger than yourself. It's really inspiring. And so who do you think enjoys cooperative systems in play? Because most of gaming, even now, you all know this, it's full of competitive games. And everybody that jumped on gamification is mostly using competitive mechanics. So there's all this competitive mechanics in our digital world, outsized to the amount of it in the real world, as you point out, Dan. So, like, who is it that loves all that? And who are the people that love cooperative games? You've all created cooperative games and seen who love them.
I mean, I don't think there's any particular player motivation that can't find satisfaction in a cooperative environment. Like, to me, cooperation isn't a motivation. I think that, like Dan said, it's everywhere. It's universal. I think that competition is low-hanging fruit. And so it was some of the first games that were made, which became the more games that were made, which became the majority of games that were made. And now it's ubiquitous. But I don't think that is any more than a reflection of the amount of friction it takes to design. It takes a little bit more friction to design something that's cooperative than it does, it's like action movies. They're kind of the lowest hanging fruit. Pew, pew, bang, bang. We get all of that instinctual, like, fight or flight response. It's very arousing. And so we're engaged. You can get those levels of engagement from almost anyone with cooperative mechanics. It just takes more time.
Yeah, it's harder.
There's also a demographic issue here. So if you look at, I'm sure folks here are familiar with Nick Yee's work. And he's done a big survey of motivations. And one of the things that you find is the competition motivation tends to be very, very strong in young men in their 20s. And for pretty much everyone else, it tends to fall off after that. So the majority of the reasons why people do things are not competition. But if you happen to be a young man, it is one of your strongest motivations. And maybe that's cultural, maybe that's biological, who knows, but it seems to exist. And if you looked at the early industry, it was heavily focused on young men. And that's I think there's a historical aspect to this that plays into why it's so prevalent. It also, in individualistic cultures, cooperation is ultimately about coordination across many people. And in individualistic cultures, such as the United States, you tend to see a lot of more self-centered activities. And so people tend to have these narratives about, like, there's a limited pool of resources, I need to look out for myself, I need to protect my own, and you start to get into this very competitive mindset. So there's a cultural aspect to it as well.
Matt, what do you see?
Just to build on Chelsea's point, I think when it comes to games, and I can speak directly with board games in particular, it's a lot easier to do a competitive game because you can leverage the other brain sitting across the table. You just set up an environment and then just let the two people have at it, and you don't have to create any kind of intelligence in the system to provide the conflict. But I think over the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen all sorts of different kinds of new technology, in the board gaming space for how to make viable opponents and more interesting environments that are challenging to a group of people. Where before it was more like cooperative games were these nice little sharing and caring exercises for kids, but weren't really engaging in the way that a typical board game would be. So I think we're starting to learn how that works, and in the board gaming space also we're seeing a lot more stories being generated and being integrated into like campaigns, so that you're not playing the same game over and over again, and that lets the environment evolve and lets the characters evolve, and you start getting all these different storytelling aspects that you probably got in video games more than we've had in the board gaming world. But I think that's widened the audience a bit to anybody who really enjoys a good story, because they can take on the role of the protagonist and see this changing environment and so on. And it seems to fit that cooperative game mold better than some of the other games have in the past.
Now, is this what you're talking about related to your embracing of the Legacy series and doing Pandemic Legacy?
I think it's more, so certainly yes, but there are also other, like the American School of Board Game Design has got a lot more story elements. It's less, and we've seen just a huge fusing of in Europe, you've got these cleaner systems historically, and in the US, we had more story-driven ones. Now it's all this wonderful, diverse mishmash you can draw from all these different sort of inspirations. But I'm seeing a lot more story-driven games coming out in the past 3, 4, 5 years. And you look at some of the ones that are topping the charts on like Board Game Geek and so on. You've got Pandemic Legacy, you've got Gloomhaven, things with a longer arc and more development, and they're both cooperative for that matter.
Let's dig into cooperative system design. Let's. So, because we're dancing around it, and I really want to get into the systems and mechanics because it's very juicy. But of course, it's driven by the stuff on top. So, Matt, why are stories so interlocking with cooperative systems? How is it that in your own work, can you sort of piece apart the core cooperative systems at the heart of your own work and then talk about how those melded with the story elements?
That's a lot. That's a lot to unpack.
Sorry, but I just
stories. Though, I mean, one of the things I'll talk about is like stories have got these structures, and I am very new to this space, right? I'm not a screenwriter. I didn't study literature and so on. I'm just starting to scratch the surface of what's possible there. But some of the things I've really learned is how you can structure things. You can have these different scenes, and you can break things down into beats, and really kind of play with people's emotions over time. And that, just looking at that, has started to help me understand a recipe for providing more engagement. Where before I was doing everything intuitively and going, oh, wow, people seem to be engaged when I do it this way. Now I may be more looking at, okay, moment to moment, how do I want to be providing different stimuli that gets people excited, or then gives them a little bit of a break, gives them some time to, internalize what they've learned, gives, basically structuring different emotions over time. And that's the kind of stuff that I've learned the most from when, like reading books on screenwriting. How can I take that and apply it to my games, both at a a single game and then stretching it out over the course of an entire arc. If we've got a campaign experience.
Chelsea,
It made sense.
yeah, Chelsea and Dan, yeah, how does that apply to what you do?
It reminds me a lot of level design in video games.
Yeah, exactly.
Where and this gets back to this core idea of player versus environment. Well, if you have player versus environment, you have to author and design the environment, and the environment is usually some sort of sequential or structured series of encounters, scenarios, contexts for play, and that opens up because ultimately a lot of what we think of as narrative and story in games, and there's many ways of approaching this, but one very common way is to say, okay, this is a set of emotional journeys we're going to take you on, and because you now, like in a player versus player situation, you don't necessarily plan what comes next. The players plan what comes next. In a player versus environment situation, you now have the opportunity to say, oh, and here's what comes next based off that last outcome. And so it almost feels like much of the player versus environment tools that are coming from, that have been explored in computer games and video games, are making their way over into board games, or being rediscovered. However,
I think
the influence
reinventing the wheel over here in paper.
Yeah.
So for me, it reminded me of some of the cadence work in a lot of the free-to-play design stuff I did with Zynga and with TinyCo, thinking less about like a linear player emotional arc and more of a like a continuous like wave sinusoidal player journey. So figuring out at what cadence you can get the community super engaged around an event. When you have things that everyone has to work together towards, like a lot of free-to-play games now have these like, community achievements that happen every month or every week, depending on the cadence that they've chosen, and figuring out how to rev everyone up, figure out the duration that they can stay revved up at that higher activity rate, and then kind of fall down again. And how long do they have to rest? Does every player have to rest that much? Because the other thing is thinking about what different segments you have in that audience, because there are going to be people that just love that high and are like, okay, we got to start planning for the next event immediately after the other one. And other people are like, all right, I can log off for 5 days now. Phew, I did my part. And those were kind of the emotional journeys that I really enjoyed looking at, is how can you create a system that caters across segments and keeps a good overlapping wave of engagement.
Yes, it's not easy, is it? It's not easy. So, Dan, I know you're wrestling with a lot of these issues with your MMO.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes. I had one thought on Chelsea's on the
Yes, go for it.
Which is what we just saw there is kind of an interesting pattern that I see repeated in game design. You author an experience and you basically handcraft, here's the pacing for this thing that's going to create a particular experience. And then what Chelsea is doing is sort of taking that to the next level, which is now that we have a pattern that we know works, how do we generalize it? How do we turn that pattern into a system that we can repeat again and again? And I think of that all the time. And when you're building these cooperative systems, it's often very common to say, hey, here's the hand-authored version of player versus environment that works. And now I'm going to generalize that to a system. Here's the procedural version of that can be repeated again and again, perhaps for years. To loop that back around to the MMO design, that's exactly what we're doing with our event systems and our encounters. And so we have this whole hierarchical list of like different types of encounters categorized by number of players, difficulty, level of cooperation, amount of parallel play. And then we're basically saying, well, what is the pacing and cadence of those that happens in a systemized fashion based off the player's experience? Because each player has their own different level of experience as well that you have to mix into this, such that We can put someone into the system and they can have one of these, what feels like an authored, exciting experience as they go through it. That's probably a lot of words.
It is there something you do that's parallel or similar, Matt, in your own design work?
I'm trying to think of something. Nothing really comes immediately to mind because the gap between releases is so long. I mean, we're talking about a couple of years between, so it's hard to respond to the community super fast. I mean, we're looking at 6 months before an expansion could be put out. And we're not doing a whole lot of print on demand or, like the equivalent of free to play. So I think it's just the cycles are so long that we can't quite react to the community quite as fast.
So how do you tune your systems when you're developing a new game?
I make a lot of prototypes and I mail them out to remote testers, and I ask them to videotape themselves playing the game, and I watch hundreds of hours of video, and usually on 2x speed and log and keep logging.
Wow.
So yeah, I don't know a whole lot of other board game designers that do that, but I just picked that up in industry working in user experience design and brought that methodology over into board games. And it's worked pretty well. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can capture on video that you can't get in self-report, as you guys all know. And then being out of the room is a great way to ensure that I'm getting better data.
How do you tune your systems, Dan?
So we have a data community, and we have them play it. And so the nice thing about online multiplayer games is you can pop in and watch people play. So in one of our games, we had an invisible mode, so you could pop in and just like wander around through the game, joining different groups and watching them play the game. So it's a version of videotaping. One of the challenges with these games is there's so many interactions going on. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interactions. Your players are playing tens of thousands of hours, and you can only observe so much of that. So the other thing that we do, of course, is analytics. So we're gathering analytics on the back end, like what people are doing, how they're doing it, when they're doing it. And those analytics are really only useful in terms of when we specifically ask a question. So it's like, we want to know, there seems to be an issue with loot drops in this particular area. And we can ask the analytics, we can dig in and see if we can get some good numbers out of that. Ultimately though, analytics only provide a rough check on what the reality of the situation is. And then we still have to come up with, here's the very human-centric solutions that take psychology into a result, and like how the dynamics of the culture. One of the things you find in these online games is that in a board game you have house rules. It's like, here's how we interpreted the rules and here's how we think we play. In an MMO, those house rules are shared with one another and become this incredibly dominant, solid culture, and people have language for how they talk about things and values that are not inherent in the game at all. They're inherent in the community. And so you have to take into account these things that are not at all mathematical. They are weird historical artifacts. They are strange, psychological quirks. They're bizarre, ways that humans interact in groups. And then, come up with a solution that you hope works. And as a result, because you have very little understanding of how the human brain works, you end up doing a lot of iteration.
So I have an anecdote that goes with that, and I'm super curious if either of you two have experienced this. When Michael and I were working on Choice Chamber, which was like a Twitch-based mini MMO, we were the ones DMing it essentially, and DMing it actively. And I was DMing it once, and I fell asleep. And what this did was it gave the players the run of the rules and the game. And so they had 8 hours on our server when play sessions had usually only been an hour to an hour and a half before, when we had the server active. And we learned so much about who our players were. There were people who figured it out. They're like, Beep, who was the DM, they were like, Beep is gone. Beep is asleep. What do? We have to does anyone know how to wake Beep up? Like, does anyone have Michael's, information? Some people were like, oh, look at this new feature. This is totally broken. Let's abuse it. And they started like ramming on this one feature that we'd left active. We were the ones who triggered all of the enemy waves. And so without enemy waves, the generation rate for city progress was just completely wild. And there were people who were like, we should go and see all the content that we haven't been able to get to so far. And there are other people who are like, no, we gotta build out the base. And it was really fun to see what limitations they set for themselves and how they tuned their own experience. And I'm wondering if you guys have ever had that moment where, the community emerges something that you had no idea about, that you then like either wanted to integrate or immediately shut down. Because for us, it was just a really funny experience to wake up the next day and see what had happened.
Yeah, I don't know if I've encountered anything that extreme. You always run it when you're blind testing. You're not there. I can't put myself in the box. So you kind of put everything together, you ship it off, and you hope. And then when you're watching the video, if they run into situations where they're not covered by the rules, you just kind of have to see what they do. And you do learn what they will play naturally, or what their expectations are in a way that you wouldn't if you're sitting next to them, where they're like, okay, well, what do we do? And they're expecting you, and they're watching your reactions, even if they're just subtle ticks in your physical, how you're sitting, or if you're leaning in or leaning out, and they pick up on all that stuff. So when I'm remote, I can really see, okay, well, what are their expectations for how this should work? Because it's just not in the rule book.
There, on Realm of the Mad God, we had, which was another MMO we worked on, we had a special key that was required to get into a dungeon. And we were like, oh, we'll make this key that drops in the world, and you need the key to get into this basically the boss after the final boss. And so that boss had a lot of really good loot, and we thought people would be incentivized to do these other activities in the world because of that. So that was our theory about how human psychology would work. This is what happened. People figured out there's a cooperative game, there's guilds, there's groups. They figured out, oh, wait, the key only drops from certain spots. So what we're going to do is we're going to camp those spots and get the vast majority of those keys. And so now we own most of the supply of those keys. And because it's a cooperative game, when the door to that final boss comes up, we're going to say, we have keys to this, except we're only going to let in people that we like. And so they basically set up this kind of protection racket around who would get in and who wouldn't. And if someone had a bad reputation because they had not treated this guild well or something, they would basically say, we're not going to open the door unless you leave. And so they would force people out. And it ended up being this whole power structure, elite guild that was forcing other people to do what they wanted based off what we thought was a relatively simple mechanic. And when we took it away, they were very upset, because to them, this was a whole political game on top of the core game. And the political game, from some of them, was much more interesting and exciting than the actual game itself. So by fixing that, oh, our theory was wrong and we need to change that, we were actually destroying value for a lot of the players in the game, and maybe making the game a little more pleasant for other people.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Human nature, man.
Yeah.
So something I'd love to get a story from each of you is to talk about how that core system, that core idea comes to life in a cooperative game. And anything, especially anything that's special, like Matt, I really love, you've got 2 franchises going now, right?
Right. Yeah.
Pandemic and Forbidden Everything, right?
Right.
So you're continuing to develop them, but they're both based on a core mechanic.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's strange. The simpler the engine, the core loop or what have you is, it seems the easier it is to adapt it to different environments. So I've taken Pandemic in all sorts of different directions. We just released Pandemic Fall of Rome. So the same underlying mechanisms have barbarian tribes invading Rome, where you're trying to negotiate with them, make alliances, protect Rome from falling, your cities are sacked, and so on. You get all this additional material, but underneath it, it's pandemic. It's recognizable as pandemic. And I think that it's worked largely because, for us, it works because it's easy to market, and it's easy to pick up and understand that central mechanism and still get a different experience. So a lot of the problems with board games is that you have to take out that rule manual and understand how the game works. And that's just a huge, huge hit that you have to take before you can get playing. And when you kind of understand the structure of it, a lot of that goes away, and you can just kind of dig into it's almost enjoyable learning what the differences are and recognizing how it's been tweaked, and then you can just kind of dive into exploring that new space. So that's been kind of the philosophy with that brand extension. Similar thing with the Forbidden series, except there it's more of where adventure is going on this serial. You think of like Indiana Jones, modeled after the old adventure serials in the movie theaters. So it's a similar thing here, where you play one game and then one game leads to the next with a common, recognizable kind of structural elements.
How did you first have the original sparks for those games? Where did it come from?
Oh, wow. It was just through raw experimentation and play. For pandemic, I knew I wanted to do a cooperative game. I knew the enemy was going to be disease. I knew I wanted it to be on a graph, nodes and lines that representing the world. I just kind of had those ideas floating around. And I wanted multi-purpose cards. So I had some mechanical hooks, and I had the antagonist picked out. But I really didn't know how it would work. So I just started fooling around with a deck of cards and some cubes and some pawns, and stumbled into the mechanism that amplifies and periodically bumps up the threat level, leads to chaos and so on. And when I stumbled into that, I was really hooked, and that kind of brought me through the rest of the 3 years that it took to develop that first game.
3 years, huh?
Yeah, that one took longer.
Wow. Dan, can you talk about how you first came up with the idea for one of your games?
Sure. I mean, it's remarkably similar. You build up this list of mechanics in your head. Like you say, oh, it's a nodal graph. It's like, yes. I'm like, my brain immediately sparks, and it's like there's an entire universe of game ideas there. So, for example, I was very mesmerized by building in Minecraft, and so that's one of the ideas that I've been dabbling with recently. And it's just this idea of like, okay, what are different ways of putting blocks in the world? And we experimented with that in a game called Beartopia, which was released on the Daydream, which nobody has played. But it was a cooperative MMO Animal Crossing, essentially. And we had the grid, and we were playing with like, well, how do you build things in the grid? And then we're like, but there's multiple people, and as soon as you introduce people, you start to imagine what sort of behaviors they'll do, and you sort of like imagine different personas. It's like, this person wants to build things, this person wants to destroy things, this person doesn't like anybody in the group. And then you start playing with different rule sets. It's like, well, how would this person, so what if we have the ability, like Minecraft, to like just put a block anywhere? Well, then the person who has infinite blocks is going to wall everybody in like one of that old horror, what's the cask of, well, I forget the
Cask of Amontillado.
Yes, where they wall the person away in the wine cellar, and then he dies. Which is a lot like what happens in The Sims. So these sort of behaviors are just going to happen. So you're like, okay, that's a design problem. I don't want that to happen. So you always sort of keep at the top of your list, these are my aesthetic goals. I don't want people to be walled into a wine cellar so they die a horrible death, which in a building game is going to occur. And so we're like, well, what if people voted on things? And so, there's a whole universe of voting systems out there. And so we started playing with different voting systems. But voting systems don't feel very thematically correct for the game. It's sort of like, I place the object, and then you vote on whether or not that object gets to stay there. It's very limited. And so then we're like, well, what if people were contributing resources? That's more thematically appropriate. But resources, votes are really just another resource. Like, we think of voting as like this super special activity, but a vote is just a very specific type of economic transfer. You have a vote object and you give it into a pool that is the vote collector pool. And so you can start to think about these things a little more abstractly. So it said, what if instead of voting, what you're doing is your vote is a piece of wood. And you get a limited amount of wood because we've cleverly set up the system so you can only harvest like 10 wood a day. And because you can only harvest 10 wood a day, that's the equivalent of saying you have 10 votes. So now you can contribute 10 wood towards one of these building projects. But because the building project might require 40 wood, I can only contribute a little bit. And so now other people determine whether or not this thing succeeds. And now we've got a voting system that works with the community, that works with the theme of building things in the world. And so, but this is all like lots and lots of experimentation. And you're basically like starting with a general idea, like a really rough mechanical concept, like building blocks. And then you're saying, like, how do people interact with that? And you're finding all sorts of horrible problems. And then you're trying to solve the problems, and you try solutions, and those fail. And you keep iterating for, as you say, 3 years. And then hopefully you come up with something, and often you don't.
And you keep marching forward. Yeah, that's Chelsea. What's been your experience with this?
So all of the cooperative games that I've ever started with have come from me having a sort of sublime real world experience and wanting to capture that and recreate it for others, or expose them to it for the first time, potentially. So with City Stream, it was this idea of wonders, thinking about the ancient wonders of the world and some of the modern wonders of the world, and how impossible all of those are without massive social cooperation. I mean, give or take involuntary cooperation. We'll put that aside for a little bit. And just trying to figure out, like, is the idea of building something awe-inspiring enough for people? And is it enough to make this beautiful work of art to have been a part, even if only a very, very small part, and kind of put that to the test? And that was kind of where City Stream came from. It was like, can you build this city? Are you willing to defend this city? Are you willing to work hard enough to make, the ultimate wonder or monument? We're going to give you a lot of customization options so you can make it artistic. You can fight for colors. And we did see like color wars start, and the colors had absolutely no bearing on the mechanics whatsoever. They were literally just a slight resource drain. And we saw people just start to take this collective art project very seriously. There were people who couldn't stand the color green. If it came up anywhere, they would immediately stop what they were doing and get rid of. And I loved that. And they made beautiful things together. And that was really cool.
Let's talk a little bit about cooperative systems outside of games. You're all game designers and you really understand, okay, I'm going to do a cooperative game versus some other kind of game. When you look in the world outside of games, and it can, be meta games on top of games, or apps, social media, politics, where do you see cooperative systems that inspire you, that you think might be working? And inside of games too, but I really like to look at these systems both inside and outside of games. To your point, Dan, inspiration comes from everywhere. So where are you seeing cooperative systems that interest you, or maybe even the breakdown of cooperative systems? Social media.
For something that I think is succeeding, the first thing that leapt to mind was Wikipedia. Just looking at the wealth of material that's added to that, and just looking at how reputation and all the other different systems that are built into that are producing a pretty amazing piece of work.
One of the ones that I actually enjoy in social media is Pinterest. Because what Pinterest does is it does a remarkably good job of surfacing sort of human classification and intent. Often when you search for an image, they have a lot of machine learning algorithms going on as well. But one of the things that you're doing is you're saying this image is like these other images. You're putting it into a collection, and usually for some purpose. Like, I am going to do wedding dresses. These are wedding dresses I like, and they're these arbitrary images, and you're sorting them into something that's intensely meaningful to you. But by doing so, you're actually providing a really clear signal to other people. Hey, these are all of a category of thing that is meaningful to a human. And so when someone else searches for, finds a wedding dress and they say related images, they'll start to see sort of this interest graph based off what other people have collected things together. And so I find that sort of this like very light cooperation that works really, really well.
Classification as cooperative play.
Yeah. We're sort of like, as a group, there's this huge set of unsorted material out there, and then we're all working together using the system of Pinterest to sort of decide what are groups of meaning. And it's very human meaning, which I really love. It's not like the algorithm is arbitrarily deciding you should be interested in this. It is people saying, putting their judgment on things and then sharing that with others. So it's sort of an informational cooperation. I really like that. One that doesn't work so well is a lot of the systems of reciprocation in things like Facebook and Twitter. Amy Jo, you and I worked on this paper on Dunbar's layers, which is sort of like this idea that, okay, people can form relationships with other human beings. Great, that's wonderful. Are there any limits on that? And it turns out there are extremely strong, hard limits on how many deep, meaningful relationships you can have. And one of the fundamental sort of like things that's built into most social media is that they assume people are computers. And computers famously have 3 numbers that they understand. There's 0. There's nothing, there is no option there. There's 1, they can deal with 1 case of a thing, and they can deal with infinite number of things, n, an infinite number of things. And it turns out humans are not like that at all. We cannot deal with an infinite number of friends or an infinite number of relationships. There's like layers of like, 150 casual people and 50 like good support people in your life. And then there's like 15 people who you can go to for sympathy. And then there's a core group of 5 that you can go to for like, hey, I'm in a crisis and I need support. And something like Twitter assumes all those layers are actually infinite, that we have the same level of intimacy with 1 million people that we have with our mother. And that's simply not true. That's not how the biology of the human brain forms friendships and relationships. And the result is that these systems can actually be damaging. You start to see low trust information crossing barriers between people. People say something to a close friend, and then a stranger goes and takes that and runs with it. We end up pouring our energy through the likes into very, very, very marginal relationships. We have a limited budget of social energy, and we pour it into like, oh, I'm going to like these 1,000 people. Those 1,000 people don't care about you. You're just wasting your time and your energy, not building meaningful relationships. And the system incentivizes that.
As I listen to you, it's like a misappropriation of the broadcast model.
Yes.
And on a hopeful note, what I'm seeing now is that people are waking up. Not everybody, but people are waking up. And more people that I think of as the canary in a coal mine people that I look to as leaders are pulling way back from social media, forming small groups, forming, monthly dinners with 8 people. And I'm just seeing a lot of small group movement, which really for me goes back to my roots in co-op, which was bringing small groups of people together to have a joyful experience. That's what you do, Matt. Your games, what are 2 and 4 player, right?
Yeah, they're 2 to 5 in some cases.
2 to 5, yeah. That's
you can have after. I mean, they provide a kind of a context for social interaction across the table, which is, I think, something that people need.
yeah. So, and there's really, do you see anything that relates to the other numbers that Dan talked about in the way that people play board games or organize themselves around board games?
Yeah, definitely. You see these right after 4 people. When you get to 5, even you start to see a real drop off because you just get too much downtime, and the connectedness of the group drops. Unless you're dealing with like a party game where everybody's involved all the time or working in teams, really 5 is kind of an upper limit, just because it's just hard to hold everybody together. You're better off like splitting off into 2 different groups.
What do you see, Chelsea?
Well, my question was, I was actually curious, is 4 and 5, like, if it applies to sets of individuals, does it also apply to like the number of unique roles that a larger group could sustain? Where if you're talking about, 5 people gives you enough time to kind of, everyone gets active at a good enough pace. Would that apply like to the number of factions a game could sustain, or unique classes that would get used frequently enough in an optimal party distribution? Like, I'm wondering if I can find that number kind of in other systemic constructs that we see a lot in multiplayer games.
It seems to depend a little on the level of cooperation. So you can have larger sort of mob-like groups that have more parallel play, lower trust. Even those tend to peter out at certain numbers. It seems that you start to get into, there's another factor here, which is shared purpose. How strong the shared purpose is has a huge impact on whether the group is cohesive. There's wonderful research on religious groups versus secular groups and the length of time that they stay together. And religious groups stay together like 5 times longer than a secular group. And a lot of it seems to have to do with this sort of like super specific shared purpose for why they're working together. So there's no one right answer, but there's a bunch of key variables that's, depending on what you're trying to build, seem to have an impact on the number of roles, the complexity of the roles, the dependency between people on the roles, that sort of thing.
Matt, do your games have roles? Different people playing synergistic roles?
Yeah, that's one of the things I put in the game, so that each player has some sort of sense of self and leads to a greater sense of autonomy within the collective. So everybody kind of has their own way to shine. Everybody's got their own superpower. So it just kind of helps bring people into the group and gives them a chance to stand out a little bit more. So it's not a big group think exercise. You can kind of say, hey, I'm really good at that. Why don't I take that on? You're really good at that. So people can kind of pipe up and say, hey, that's my job, and it's my chance.
Would you all say that creating synergistic roles like that is one of the cornerstones of cooperative design?
I think everyone needs to feel like they can contribute meaningfully. And I think roles are one of the best ways to give people that sense of uniqueness or specialness or feeling of I am needed and I am an important part. I don't think it's the only way. Like, my gut says that you can still have fun with just being generic villagers in Minecraft, but then like people tend to self-specialize anyway, even if you don't provide the roles. So I think it's just a matter again of like handedness if you want to author that, or if you want to make an emergent space for it.
It also depends highly on trust. Raf Koster and Google did a paper recently on the trust spectrum. And what you find is when people are early in their relationship, they highly coordinated, highly specialized activities are actually an incredibly bad idea, because people will flail, they'll blame each other. Imagine playing League of Legends with a bunch of people who don't know each other for the first time, who are very competitive. Like, It's a very high trust activity,
Yeah.
and it results in bad things, bad vibes all around. So you have to take into account like how well your group knows each other. So for board games, for example, one of the things that I find is that a lot of board games, cooperative board games, tend to be played by board game groups that actually know each other and are somewhat familiar with each other, and they've built up trust over the years that oh, this is going to be fine. We're going to work together. We know each other's strengths and communication styles. And like when I call you a funny name, I'm not actually insulting your mother. Like it's actually just part of the the joyful play. And so these tightly bound groups, high trust groups, are more able to do the high trust activities.
Yeah, I've certainly found that. I think they tend to work better with people who know each other. If you play a pickup game of a co-op game at a convention, for example, you may not know the person across from you, and you may have wildly different skill levels, and that can lead to some strange situations where you've got people who really don't know what to do being kind of told what to do by someone who is who has a full mastery of the game, and that can lead to some strange interactions.
That's really interesting. So we're hitting our time, and I'd like to get one more question for each of you, which is about the future. So looking forward, you could in your own work, in what you see around us, where do you see cooperative design in general and game design in particular headed? Where would you like to see it head? Is there a mechanic or a certain game that you're dying to explore or going to explore? What do you see in the future? I'll start with Chelsea.
Don't. For me, it feels like so many people in my life are so sad and so depressed and so anxious right now. The number of people I know who have had to start going on meds or going to therapy in the past 4-ish years is really sad and upsetting, and I think points to this incredible dearth of social connection and shared purpose that we have in our world right now, and everyone feeling that things are falling apart, in part because things are falling apart, and in part because all of the systems we engage with are incentivized to make us feel like everything is falling apart. And I think that we're starting to hit the limit of what we can tolerate on that front. Everyone I talk to is just, we all feel like we're holding our breath waiting for that call. And what is that call going to look like? What is that unification going to be like? And how is that unifying purpose going to survive a culture of constant criticism and cynicism and tearing things down? And I think that looking at how we can build trust, looking at how we can build purpose, and being people who see systems, I think that we might need to be part of that catalyst, part of that wake-up call, and show people that not all systems are destructive or horrific, or say, do you know all the reasons that these systems you're engaging in are destructive and horrific? And educate people and open eyes and provide hope that I think has just suffered a lot in the past few years.
I feel that right here. Dan, I'll go in the opposite direction that I did when I started. Dan.
I couldn't agree more. As we look into what makes people happy, I mean, the name of the tagline of our company is making happiness. What does it mean for a human to thrive? And one of the key things that comes up is strong friendship networks, strong support networks. And as game developers, we have the ability to directly build systems that result in players making human connections. So I think it's one of our great duties is to pursue that. Like, how do we make people's lives actively better? Just because you can motivate people by having a leaderboard where people learn to hate each other does not mean you're doing any sort of moral good to the world, for the world. So with cooperative games, I think we can actually add some of that, like, friendship formation, relationship building, higher shared purpose. We can add that to our games. One of the positive trends that I'm seeing in the video game space is that people are realizing that there's we live in this horrible hyper capitalist world, are realizing that there's actually benefits, material benefits to doing these type of things. As we get into games as services, you find that players who are having living a good life, thriving, happy, spending time with friends, doing meaningful work, doing meaningful activities, they tend to stick around. They tend to make your game the place where they want to spend time. And so I see right now, I'm just seeing this blossoming of, call it social systems design, social design, where people are learning, oh wait, cooperation and getting people to build friendships and understand each other and not be toxic with one another is actually a huge benefit to sort of our living, making a living. And those sort of things can always be warped a little bit because there's a lot of sociopathic people out there. But I do think there's an opportunity to turn the engine of American capitalism towards doing good. I don't know, that may be corrupted by American capitalism, but it's worth a shot.
I'll just build on those two things. I'm really optimistic. I've seen a lot of change in the last 10 years. When I was first developing Pandemic, people were telling me that gamers don't like cooperative games. I was told that German players don't play cooperative games, and the number of titles that have been released with a cooperative element over the past 10 years has just grown. I think it's up 400%. And so my hope, and I'm optimistic about this, is that people will no longer even make that classification. They'll just call them games, right? They'll take cooperation for granted as just a fundamental part of the way people interact with each other. That it used to be that games and competition were synonymous. Now we may even see a flipping where you expect that kind of cooperation happening, and then you almost have to justify the competition because maybe it's the lazy way out. And I hope some of this bleeds into the way people interact with each other across the table, and how even human interaction is perceived culturally. So I think we've got the opportunity to kind of set examples, because you try out different behaviors in games, and if we can build those muscles in these safe environments, maybe that can bleed off into the way people interact with each other in their daily lives.
That's a beautiful and hopeful thought. And I think all of us very much want to be part of that and part of that solution. Thank you, system designers, for sharing your perspective today. I just loved hanging out with you. Hey, innovator, wondering what innovation advice you should follow? It turns out that one size does not fit all. Take our Innovators Quiz and get your free customized cheat sheet packed with smart innovation tips that are tailored to you. Go to gamethinking.io/quiz to get started.